Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and tonight I'm going to try and tackle a big question in religion, in spirituality, a question which has vexed some of the greatest minds that have contemplated this question. And that is the question of human nature and what is the authentic or essential nature of humanity. And even more specifically, is human nature evil? It's something that many philosophers have asked themselves as they've looked back at history and the sort of atrocities that we've committed against one another in the name of ideology or religion. And it's something that we may indeed be asking ourselves today as we look around at the world. Particularly with the rise of social media, we seem to see the most profound evil in our nature being brought to the surface and amplified to a deafening level. And, it's stoked division, it's stoked hatred between people, and misunderstanding and tribalism and all of the really worst qualities of human beings. And we can look at how we act online and think to ourselves, is this really just an evil species? And you'd be forgiven for thinking that. But, it's a complex question whether human nature is evil. And it's something that's difficult to get right. Because on the one hand, you can be too cynical and then you can think that people are more evil than they really are. And then you might even dehumanize them. And that leads to atrocities against other people. But conversely, when you get ideologies that assume human nature is more good than it really is, you get people who prescribe to that and give up their power, it leads to 100 million lives being lost, as history has indeed taught us. So I guess the obvious thing to say at the start of all this is that we certainly do have evil in our nature, and a lot of it. But are we inherently evil? Are we just doomed to be evil? Is that the most essential kind of nature of humanity? Or is there good in there? And is the good actually stronger? These are all things that I've thought about throughout my own life, throughout my own process of questioning such things. And I want to share my own insights that I've gained through just insights that I've had by direct experience and, even reading sacred texts, the conclusions that I've reached on this topic. So this could turn out to be quite a long video. There's a lot of ground to cover. There's a lot to unpack in trying to answer this question. But even though it is long, it's going to be, I hope, packed full of wisdom, packed full of golden nuggets of truth that are difficult to find elsewhere. And I'm going to break the video up. I really want to discuss this question in a few different parts. The first sort of thing I'll look at is what makes us up as human beings, and if there's anything within that which has an inclination towards evil. Next, I will consider the idea that we get in the book of Genesis. That is quite a defining idea in Western spirituality, that there was a fall from grace that humanity suffered when they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And what the kind of symbolism, the deeper symbolism behind that story was, and what it reveals about human nature and how that might have changed over time for the worse. Next, I will consider the idea of ignorance, which is also dealt with in many spiritual traditions, and the difference between evil and ignorance, and whether what we think is evil is really a form of ignorance. Next, I will consider the role that environmental conditions play in determining our behavior and whether that is the true nature of evil rather than anything that reflects our interior state. And then finally, I will ask the all-important question: if we have evil in our nature, how can we change that? Indeed, can we change that? And what are some of the ways we might be able to do that? So that's a lot of ground to cover. Let us begin. What is it about us that makes us evil or inclined towards evil acts? I don't necessarily think the whole of the human being is evil in its inclination, but I do think that there are certain parts of us that lend themselves very easily to the influence of evil and doing evil. And there's a few culprits down through the ages that often get blamed for being responsible for human evil. So the first part of us that often gets blamed for evil is the so-called animal nature within us, the nature in us from an earlier stage in our evolution, which we're trying to develop beyond, but still kind of clings to us and still makes us behave in primitive ways that are quite animalistic. These parts of us are often attributed to the passions and the instincts. And if you think about it in terms of the human brain, it's really the amygdala, it's the lizard brain that is responsible for this part of our being. I've spoken about this in my video on what are angels and demons that I did quite a while ago, looking at how the kind of depictions of demonic figures are always kind of reptilian or animalistic looking, with a lot of hair and horns and things like that, because it's reflecting the bestial side of our nature, and the fact that that is where the instincts and the passions come from. And that when we are in that state, when we are closer to the state of the animal, we have very little control over those impulses and are very easily led by them. And we see animals as being very territorial and being very quick to go into fight or flight and survival mode and try and fight off other animals that enter their turf. If there's a bit of food there that one animal needs to eat to survive and there's another animal there that's hungry, the hungry animal doesn't think about the rights of the animal that was there first. It just moves in and takes the food. If an animal feels its reproductive urges coming on, it doesn't think about consent, it just acts. And so, you know, this is seen as a potential source of many of the evils that we see perpetrated by certain human beings. But I think it would be wrong to say that everything that comes from our animal nature is necessarily bad. You know, there's a certain purity and innocence to the way that our animal nature can behave. And if we follow our instincts in a responsible way, they're actually very helpful. You know, they let us know when we're in danger. You know, we need the animal part of us to survive. So it's not fair to just say everything that is part of us that comes from our animal nature is evil. But it can certainly manifest in an evil way if we give in to that nature too much. But what other parts of us have been typically held responsible for evil? Another part is the human mind. It can be really divisive and contested to talk about the human reason and whether or not that has been something that has been ultimately good or ultimately a force for evil. Because, you know, we have solved many problems and alleviated much human suffering and understood creation and the natural world through use of human reason. It has certainly done great things in that respect. But there have also been terrible things that have been done in the name of science, which also must be attributed to human reason. So the fact that we are rational, intelligent beings is not necessarily an inherently good thing in our nature, and in fact can be a source of great evil. You know, and if you look at intelligence in animals, quite often it's the animals that have more intelligence, such as chimpanzees and dolphins, and indeed human beings, that exhibit the greatest cruelty. These are the animals that hunt for sport, not just because they need to eat. These are the animals that torture one another or other animals. And so intelligence can not only make the world brighter and more enlightened, but can also come up with new and creative ways to cause suffering for other beings, depending on how it's utilized. So again, the intellect, the reason is neither good nor bad. And then when you get to the level of soul or spirit, the consciousness, or, the heart that is pure and filled with compassion, at that point it's hard to see how evil can manifest from those parts of us. But certainly those so-called lower parts of our nature, particularly the lower mind and the animal instincts and the emotions, these are the spheres or the domains in which evil typically tends to manifest, although those levels of our being are not wholly, completely evil. They can be good as well. But it begs the question, where does evil come from? And what is it exactly which turns these parts of us towards evil? And why these parts of us? And really, we commit acts of evil when we adopt a certain attitude or, philosophy of life, whereby we are, first of all, separated from everything else, separated from other people, separated from the planet, and we see ourselves and our needs as not related to anything else, as though we exist as an island. And so we feel that we needn't concern ourselves with anything but ourselves. And then we show concern for ourselves above all others, because we believe that because we are experiencing life from the point of view of this individual, that this individual must be more important than any other individual. We let ourselves be led astray by what we want to be true, based on our feelings of pleasure and pain. So this sense of separation of the self and the raising of the self as more important than any other person or any other thing really is where the trouble starts. And when things happen that make that more difficult, we feel pain. And when we experience things that reinforce that sense of reality that we have, it causes us pleasure. And so there's a whole series of experiences that we have that leave a memory and eventually start to weave a story, which is the story of who we are, the things that we like, the things that we dislike, and the things that happen to us to help us to understand that, and the story we tell about what we're going to do in the future to make sure that we won't have to do the things that we dislike anymore, and we'll get more of the things that we like. And that is more important than any other consideration. And so this sense of self that forms around this collection of experiences, this sense of identity, is what is known in what is broadly described as, Eastern philosophies, as the ego, as it's translated into English. The ego, the sort of false self. That's not to say that any kind of sense of self or any sort of sense of personality is the same as ego. We inevitably have to live in a world where we experience life as an individual. We experience ourselves as separate from other things to an extent. And our perception is limited to what is within the domain of the senses of this individual body. So to some extent, it's inevitable that we should form a sense of self, that is our operating system. The problem is when we can't see past that, when we become so attached to that experience, that it leads us to have a distorted view of the importance of that. And because of that distortion, it leads to us taking more than we need, getting out of harmony with others, out of harmony with the universe, and ultimately causing harm. So to use Buddhist terminology, is really when we start to crave and grasp at things that, the ego is reinforced, and a form of personality which is egoic is reinforced. And the way that often manifests is through our impulses, our passions, and even our thoughts, because that is the level of our being that is kind of a part of this world of limitations, where things are separate or seem separate from one another, where there is this kind of illusory nature of samsara and maya. And so that is why we see evil and ignorance manifesting at that level. That's sort of the interface for the sense of separation that emerges as we experience this reality. So I want to talk about the story of Adam and Eve and the fall of humanity in the Garden of Eden, because it's a very powerful story, and I don't necessarily think it's literally true, but I think there are elements that are true, but perhaps have been raised to an allegory for additional effect. I think that there was probably a mitochondrial Eve, and there was a kind of a common male ancestor for all people. So there's elements of truth, but it's sort of there's a layer of fable and symbol that kind of makes this more than just a account of events that happened. But it remains true nonetheless in terms of the moral lessons and how it's an allegory for a process that humanity really did go through. So the big idea in the story of Adam and Eve is that human beings were in this kind of pure, holy state in the beginning, and then something happened, and something happened in their consciousness, in the way that we perceive the world, which caused us to fall, which caused us to fall down into a lower state that is further from the divine, that is suffering more, that is more inclined towards evil and sin. And the explanation, in a symbolic, allegorical sense, for why this happened is because we ate from the tree of knowledge, because we wanted to know good and evil, like God knows good and evil, and we wanted to be like God. And that was the thing that caused us to fall. Knowing good and evil, having shame in our nakedness, and ultimately being subject to death as the consequence of having that knowledge. And so there's a lot to unpack there. So the original state of Adam and Eve was one of innocence, much like the animal kingdom, in a positive sense of how the animal kingdom lives. And then something happened which led to suffering for the human race that wasn't there before. And I think the most obvious explanation for this allegory is that it's somehow related to human beings initially gaining sentient self-awareness and the consequences that come from that. Yeah, and this is how we gain knowledge. Now, sentient self-awareness, it's got many positives, don't get me wrong, and there is probably a purpose for us gaining that self-awareness, which revolves around knowing the mind of God, knowing the universe, and figuring out how to kind of integrate everything that has been separated into individual things in the physical universe back into God. But that sentient self-awareness is also something which can cause us great suffering. It is something that can... It's really the thing that made it possible for us to gain a coherent sense of self, as distinct from other things in the world. And so ultimately it was the reason why we were able to form ego. And even though we can know things and we can have ideas, which theoretically should bring us closer to God, paradoxically it actually made us further from God, because suddenly we had thoughts and anxieties about this imperfect world that we live in, that created more and more walls between us and being able to see the glory and the simplicity and the beauty of the divine. More and more degrees of separation. And each one of us as an individual, we go through a process which is kind of like a snapshot of what it must have been like for the collective humanity evolving from a state of relative innocence towards self-awareness, and going through the fall as a result. Because, we all start off as children, we're innocent, we're carefree, and then little by little as we go through life, we learn about just how messed up the world really is. We learn that we're going to no longer exist one day. We learn that adults aren't perfect, that they make mistakes, and yet they're the only people that we have to look up for to learn how to do things in this world. We learn that there are people out there who are suffering profoundly, and there's nothing we can do about it. There's all these wars, there's all this poverty, and the people in power don't necessarily have our best interests at heart, that they might in fact be driven by greed or lust for power or the need to control people or whatever it is. And they're not necessarily there because they're competent and because they want to help people, which is why they should be there. And so we become aware of all these little ways that life is not great, that the world is not a very nice place. And so it causes us suffering, and it darkens our view of the world, and it hardens our heart. And so we can see this as kind of like a sort of smaller version of the fall that Adam and Eve suffered. It casts a pall over our existence. It casts a black veil over everything. And it makes us feel separated from God, because as you observe the physical world, you go through much of the same line of reasoning as the Buddha did when he received the Four Noble Truths, that life is suffering. The source of suffering is in the fact that we crave for things because we exist in this physical world. And the Buddha took an extra step in teaching us that there is an end to suffering by renouncing our attachment to that false self that causes the suffering. But, before we reach that insight, we're just stuck in this world of suffering. And we gradually come to the realization that we are in this world of profound suffering and profound separation and a lack of dignity. Because we have a sense of self, suddenly a sense of personal dignity is something we value, and we realize we don't have that, and it makes us unhappy. Like when Adam and Eve covered themselves in shame when they became aware of their nakedness. This realization that comes from the fall, it's this realization of all the different ways in which we suffer, where, to know good and evil. Whereas before in the Genesis account, everything's good. God saw that this was good and this was good. And now suddenly there's a perception of evil as well. And, when the serpent gave the apple, or the fruit of the tree of knowledge to Eve, the serpent said, "You will know good and evil as God knows good and evil." And God can know good and evil, but for human beings to know good and evil is different, because we're more invested in evil things not happening to us. We feel that suffering, and so it creates attachment for us, because we don't want to suffer, and we don't want that loss of that self that we think completely defines us. And the serpent also said that when Eve ate the apple, she would be like God. And what does it mean to be like God? What is God like? God is the sovereign ruler of all creation, the king of everything. And God is also the ground of all being, the kind of being itself, the one thing that is sort of the foundation of everything else. And so for a human being to be like God means raising up that personality to be the most important thing in the world, more than anything else. So it becomes kind of like a ground of our own being in a subjective sense. And we want to be master of all, the way that God is. We want our personalities to occupy that position. And that really is the essence of the egoic way of looking at life. And, when we have the pathology of the ego, that sense of our separateness from others, combined with the suffering of not being able to meet our distorted idea of what our individual needs are, then that combination puts us into a really negative state where we lash out at other people and we hurt other people and we want to cause harm to other people. And that is really how egoism and the suffering that comes from identifying with the ego leads to acts of evil. And we see the suffering that Adam and Eve felt when they were expelled from the garden as a result of their fall. And the whole Genesis account after that is, up until at least the flood of Noah, is really just a story about the moral deterioration of the human race. From when Cain slays Abel all the way through to the story of the depravity of the human race just before God floods the world. And that deterioration begins with the fall into the state of ego. And when we eat the tree of knowledge, we must die, because the thing that we identified with before that was the divine spark, which is not separate from divinity. And divinity never passes away. So we were something eternal, and we might not have known that in an intellectual sense, but we had a kind of intuitive kind of connection to that. Or it was at least not as obscured as when we had the sense of self, the sense of the ego, and now suddenly we're identified with something that is based in a physical world where things pass away. And so we must die because we've identified with something that can die. So long story short, the story of Adam and Eve and their fall in the garden is really the story of how we develop self-awareness and how that gives rise to ego. And ego is the thing that separates us from God and causes us to do evil in the world, so that we stray more and more and more from the purpose that God intended for us, a purpose that is in harmony with the divine order. To talk about our fallen nature, in Western religion, we often talk about human beings' sinful nature, which implies an evil nature. But other religions, and even esoteric forms of Western religions, such as Gnosticism, tackle this slightly differently. They say that the nature of humanity that comes from identifying with the ego is not one of evil, but rather of ignorance. And so the natural state of humanity is one of ignorance. And there's not necessarily a fall story that explains how we went from innocence to ignorance. But because, we would have been ignorant even when we were innocent. But there is this explanation that we exist in an ignorant state, and that is ultimately a bad thing. It separates us from truth, the absolute reality. And I think the key difference between evil and ignorance is that evil is really about intent. We know that something that we do is wrong, and we do it anyway. The person who is ignorant does something wrong, but they don't know that what they're doing is wrong, because they don't have the knowledge that would make that possible. And I think in my own observation of people, most of the time when we exist in this egoic way and we do things that cause harm to others, it's not because of evil, it's because of ignorance. And that's considerably easier to forgive than evil. I think there certainly is evil in the world that goes beyond mere ignorance, and I think that there is an increase in evil in the world, particularly in the last decade or so, or maybe the last few decades. But it still remains the fact that evil is rarer than ignorance. And often we presume evil of people, when in fact it's just ignorance. So like an example of this might be, somebody parks badly. We think, oh, that person, they're being a jerk. But often it's just that the person wasn't really paying attention, and they just, that they weren't even thinking about other people. And they weren't even thinking about the harm that they might have been doing by making it harder for somebody else to get out of their car who parked next to them because there were no other spots. But if they became aware of what they had done, they would be immediately apologetic, and they would perhaps even try and rectify their actions. That is the difference between evil and ignorance. And I think most of the time people are just ignorant. But evil and ignorance do have the same source in the ego, I think. And when ignorance becomes evil, when we become aware of the things we have done in ignorance, we've got one of two choices. We can repent and we can not make the mistake again, or we can find some justification from the ego as to why we deserve something. At that point, ignorance starts to transform into evil. Or really, more fundamentally than identifying with the ego, it's identifying with a form of the personality that is based in the material world, with all of the limitations that places upon us, what we're able to perceive, and so forth. What we're able to perceive, what we're likely to consider more important, what kind of drives and kind of intentions we're more likely to give into or follow, and so forth. And this distinction between evil and ignorance, and how it is related to an intention to do something even though we know it's wrong, also explains the difference between evil in human nature and the sorts of things that animals do, which seems negative or evil, but is explained some other way other than evil. Things which animals do when they follow their animal nature might not be evil in the case of an animal, because they are in that state of ignorance, because they don't have a system of morals. They can't help but follow that animal nature. Whereas human beings have that ability of introspection, and they can. When a lion eats a gazelle, we don't think of that as evil. But if a human being kills needlessly some other living thing, that we consider evil. So we see that ignorance in the animal kingdom, and animals don't have ego. And so even though they act in a way that has characteristics of the ego, like in self-preservation, even though they have no sense of self per se, it's not the same as acting out of ego. And although our ignorance is a result of living in the state of having an ego, that is simply the way that ignorance manifests for a being that has self-awareness. For an entity that doesn't, such as an animal, that ignorance manifests differently. But ultimately, that grasping at the material world and that drive to survive in the material world, no matter what, and being unable to see past that, stems from this state of ignorance that we exist in and that animals exist in as well. And the key is to move beyond that. So far, I've spoken a lot about things that are implicit in our nature, that are intrinsic to us as human beings in some way, our inner world, and that being an explanation for evil in human nature. But there is another school of thought which says that the true reason for evil among human beings has got nothing to do with morals or some kind of metaphysical evil or even the ego, but rather it has to do with our material conditions. This is something that is very popular among left-wing political philosophies, particularly of an atheist variety, Marxism being the most notable example, whereby social being determines social consciousness. We do evil things because of our material conditions, which force us to act in that way. And I can think of an obvious example of this, which is connected to the country that I live in, Australia. A story that you hear time and time again about the families who came over here because their ancestors were sent here as convicts was that, they lived in the cruel, unforgiving kind of industrial hellscape that was 19th century England. And they were poor working class people, and they needed to feed their family, but they didn't have enough money, so they stole a loaf of bread from the market to feed their family. And for that, they were arrested for theft and sent to the penal colony. So, this is a perfect example of social being determining social consciousness, and our environmental conditions being the thing that leads to us doing an action which would be judged by conventional morality as evil or sinful. But it has to be said, that is an extreme example, and it doesn't necessarily prove the maxim that when we do evil, it's always because of our material conditions, which effectively mean we can't help it because of our environment. In fact, environmental conditions can limit our choices, but ultimately, I think it comes down to our own kind of conscience as to whether we choose evil or not. Just because we are born in a particular set of material conditions, that does not dictate what we're going to do with our life. On the sort of most individual level, we can have mind over matter. We can feel pain, or we can be going through some other uncomfortable experience, which should, cause us to react in a way that incapacitates us from doing something. And yet our mind can numb us to the pain enough for us to push through that situation and do something we're not supposed to be able to do. That's mind over matter. That demonstrates the power of will and consciousness over our material conditions, and the ability for the latter to transform the former. And really, mind over matter, mind can be a tool, but it's ultimately the will and the consciousness exerting itself over matter. We can see how even something not as deep as consciousness, but merely the human psychology, the human mind, can actually be more persuasive and have more of an influence on us than our material realities. There was this phenomenon that was observed in former Eastern Bloc countries in Europe, where after the Soviet Union fell, many of the people who had grown up in the Soviet Union continued to behave the same way that they did, living under communist dictatorship, even though they were now politically and socially free. And this phenomenon got referred to as the wall of the mind. The wall, of course, referring to the Berlin Wall, which separated East from West, which fell, representing the fall of communism. But these people were still living in communism in their minds, irrespective of their material conditions. And this is really the lesson of the Matrix, that the people and the forces that are in control of our world, who are trying to control us, do so by making a prison for the mind above all else. Our perception, our perspective can change everything. And this is why you can get people who come from the most impoverished conditions who are self-made millionaires. And that's a rare exception to the rule, but it does happen. And the fact that it happens at all, once again, shows that our will, our consciousness, and ultimately our mental attitudes can be more powerful and more decisive than our material conditions. And so the implication is that evil can't be explained through material conditions, because, another implication of this is of course that we can have everything, have all of our material conditions satisfied, and still be horrible towards one another. Just look at modern Western society. Everyone's got an iPhone. We've got comforts that our predecessors 100 years ago could only have dreamt of, and yet it's not enough to make us stop attacking each other online. Come on. So, it's obviously something inside of us that's wrong, that is causing evil to happen. So I've spoken about the fact that there is evil in human nature, and while human nature isn't wholly evil, there are certainly things in us that are inclined towards evil, and I've tried to diagnose exactly what it is about us that makes us evil, makes us do evil. But what about the cure? What about the solution to evil? Is there a solution? Can we actually change our nature so that we stop being evil? Can we go through a process of repentance for our evil, followed by redemption, and leaving evil behind to become good, just, righteous people, and to build a society that reflects those same principles? I put to you that the answer is yes. So then what is the solution to evil? How can we stop ourselves from doing evil? The glib answer that everyone will tell you is, just be kind to each other. Just be nice to each other. And sure, fine, that's fine, and ultimately that is the solution, but it's not quite as simple as that. Because you can have an intention that you want to be nice, or you want to be kind, or you want to be compassionate, you want to stop doing evil, but that doesn't mean that you will stop. I've got an intention, I've had an intention for quite some number of months now, that I'm going to really get into shape physically, that I'm going to adopt a workout routine and stick to it. And I haven't done that. The intention has not translated into action. And there are a lot of excuses that I can give for why that's the case. Ultimately, it's my own fault for not being disciplined enough. But you can see how intention needs to be followed by consistency in action and discipline in action in order to really start to make the effort to change from the way that we were into the way that we can be, the best version of ourselves. And don't get me wrong, changing material conditions can help in our path to collective redemption. There are certain injustices that are perpetrated upon people which can only be rectified by changing material conditions, but that's not the be-all, and that's not the end of the solution. In order to get to the root of evil, changing material conditions is not enough. We need to change something about our nature. So we need to have the attitude of repentance. We need to recognize that there are things in us that are not healthy, that come from the ego, and we need to work to overcome those things in ourselves and transform them into something positive. But in order to do that, it's not enough to just condemn those parts of us. We need to meet those parts of our ego in a spirit of compassion and recognize that there is some genuine need, some authentic part of us that is being expressed in that egoic impulse, which has simply become distorted. And when we can meet it in that compassionate way, then we can start to unravel what is the true thing behind what has been distorted and how to express that instead. If we meet one part of our ego with another part of our ego, then the part of our ego that we're trying to remove will just get defensive, and we'll just galvanize that, and it'll be harder for us to transform. So in order to do that, we need to be capable of feeling compassion. We need to look to our heart, and we need to exercise that muscle, not just in the literal sense, but the more important sense of the heart, which is what it means spiritually. The heart has become a metaphor for the seat of the soul, for that pure compassion. And, just as with working out, those muscles aren't going to be built up unless we exercise them, unless we use them, unless we train them. And so we need to train our heart to be compassionate again, so we can meet our own ego with compassion, to transform it into something that is beneficial to us and to others. And we also need to become conscious. We need to train our conscious awareness and relearn that conscious awareness, that divine spark, is what we truly are, and that we are not the ego, and that we needn't fear getting rid of the ego and creating a personality that centers around our divinity instead. And so to remove evil within us, it really takes repentance and it takes sacrifice. We need to sacrifice our old self in order to be reborn into a more divine version of ourselves. The same way that Christ sacrificed himself. And if we can do all of that, then we can find redemption and we can remove the evil from our nature. And it won't happen overnight. It takes years and years of going through the process, and we need to tackle one thing at a time in our nature that we'd like to transform, but eventually we can find the redemption that we need to become the version of ourselves that the divine always intended us to be. And so that's the note that I would like to end this video on. I hope that you have enjoyed this exploration of evil in human nature and what the alternative is. If you have enjoyed this video, please leave a like down below, subscribe to this channel to support my work, leave any comments that you have down below, and if you want to support me even further, hit join or thanks down below. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.